Bill DeBlasio has really not done a good job when it comes to police relations between the police department and the African American community, and I dare to say he is the worst mayor since David Dinkins way back in the late 1980s. And the reason why I say that is because of his actions and his policies, especially those regarding this whole Eric Garner mess. The Eric Garner Quagmire started under his inept and really incompetent leadership. Um, when I look at what Bill de Blasio did in this case, he pretty much has set the stage for this, as I see it, an escalation between communities and law enforcement. And he really has not created a uh, situation where relations can get better. I look at the way he handled the whole Eric Garner mess, and it's pretty much embarrassing. Here we are, nearly a year later after Eric Garner was choked out, and the officer is still on the payroll, collecting a check, adding funds to his pension, and even worse, supervisors who were behind him, this black female sergeant who was behind him, is also collecting a check and getting her pension, adding funds to her pension. What that does is it sets the tone in the police department for a culture of dysfunction. And that culture is being is only going to get worse because of Bill de Blasio's weak and inept leadership. I mean, here we have a man who has two federal civil rights lawsuits against him. You have the police commissioner saying on tape that he believes that this is a chokehold. You have the mayor saying that it's a chokehold. Again, yet this man has not been terminated. Fast forward to North Carolina, where an officer is shown on tape shooting a suspect, dropping a taser on him, and then saying that this man had committed this crime in progress. That officer has been terminated. That man has been charged with murder, and pretty much the issue is being dealt with effectively. When we look at the de Blasio situation, here we have nearly a year gone by, and the Eric Garner situation still remains unresolved. And that is a testament to the dysfunctional leadership of Democratic mayors. I mean, in contrast, we look at the Abner Louima situation with Rudy Giuliani. The first thing Rudy Giuliani did, in spite of all of his rhetoric, Justin Volpe was terminated. That was the first thing he did. He made sure to distance the department from the individual who participated in the action. And he also did this in the case of Playboy, the officer who posed for Playboy, Carol Shaya. He also quickly terminated her as soon as possible. But under Bill de Blasio, this officer remains in this job almost a year later, and his black female supervisor remains in a job almost a year later. And we look at this policy, and what it's doing is putting a lot of good officers' lives at risk. Officers like Rafael Ramos and Wenjen Liu, two men who were just sitting in their car doing their duty. And thanks to this dysfunctional policy, from Bill de Blasio and his actions, those men, I believe, lost their lives. And I look at these other officers who are being shot, and a lot of it has to do with this strained relationship between the police and the community and not dealing effectively with rogue police officers. When you have a dysfunctional officer, you cannot create a culture that protects them like he has done in the case of the officer who choked out Eric Garner, Officer Pantaleo. He has pretty much protected this officer and his supervisor and prevented, good officers from being able to protect the community. When you don't take effective action against a bad employee, it encourages other employees to act out in a dysfunctional way. And when we look at Bill de Blasio's policy, he has shown that he is not an effective executive and running the executive branch of the city of New York. He has pretty much allowed the morale to go down in the police department. He has allowed, this situation to deteriorate. And instead of taking effective action to deal with it, he has pretty much let things deteriorate. And I always thought, in the case of this officer who choked out Eric Garner, he should have been gone after the first civil rights lawsuit. I mean, you don't keep a guy like this around. He is a bad officer. He sets a precedent that is bad for other officers, and he prevents good officers from being able to do their job effectively in the line of duty, and he puts other officers' lives at risk. And what he's doing, by not enforcing that policy the way Rudy Giuliani did with Justin Volpe, when you look at what he did with Justin Volpe and Carol Shaya, he was setting a tone saying that this is going to be the standard for behavior with police officers. Now, I know there were other situations like Amadou Diallo that were sad and tragic, and I really believe that there was an injustice done there, but I really believe that, you really have to start distancing yourselves from bad officers, and something really needs to be done. We really need to set a strong tone, and Bill DeBlasio, as I've seen it, has not set a strong tone. He has set the same weak, ineffective tone that David Dinkins set way back in the late 1980s when New York City became a virtual Hades. And this is something that Joe Lota warned us about. And we see it with each passing day that New York City is slowly starting to deteriorate and turn right back into that cesspool it was back in the late 1980s and 1990s. I mean, we saw indicators of this a couple of weeks ago when we had 13 shootings in one day when the weather turned hot. And the sad part is many people out here just don't see, how bad a mayor this Bill de Blasio has become. Um, his education policies are pretty much dysfunctional. And again, his law enforcement policies, he has not really done a good job of managing crime and the issues of crime in the community. He doesn't even understand how crime relates to economic investment the same way Rudy Giuliani understood how crime related to economic investment. If you don't have safe streets, people cannot go shopping, they cannot do business, and nobody wants to invest in a city that's not safe. When all this economic growth we've had is due to the reduction in crime, and a lot of people just don't understand that because it's been 20, 25 years since the worst days of New York, and in those days you couldn't even get on a train because you didn't know what you would run into. Because I remember being 14 years old and riding a train and seeing a guy snorting crack rocks right across from me when I was sitting on a train. I remember being on a train one time, which had a big piece where there were pieces of fecal matter lying on the floor. People don't have to deal with that type of chaos and dysfunction these days. They don't have to deal with bands of children roaming around on trains looking to rob people and beat people up. They don't have to worry about wilding or any other sort of insanity that plagued old New York City from the late 1980s to the early 1990s. And I even go back to the 70s with the muggers and all that other craziness. People don't know how safe it is, and they don't understand that in order to get where we are today, where we have all this investment, all these neighborhoods coming back like Williamsburg and Harlem and even parts of the Bronx, and other parts of Manhattan. In order to get to that form of investment, that all comes with a good quality police department and maintaining a quality police department. And if we look at our police department, Bill de Blasio hasn't done a good job of managing it, and he doesn't understand, how it relates to bringing that investment here. Because I remember back in the early 90s when it was so bad, businesses were leaving, people were leaving, and that was all because the city wasn't safe, and that was all because, guys like on the Democratic Party were pretty much letting everybody do whatever they wanted. Drug dealers were pretty much running the city, gangs were pretty much running the city, and they were doing whatever they want, and the city was pretty much falling apart. And it took, sadly, the death of a white tourist in order for our first black mayor to get it. And sadly, I don't want to see that happen under this Democratic mayor because he doesn't even see the slide that is getting ready to come, because the crime statistics are actually going up instead of down, and it's all happening under his watch, and he's not really handling things effectively. Again, if you can't police your police, how can they go out and police your community? And when you look at his actions again, allowing this guy to remain, this rogue officer to remain collecting a paycheck, him and his black female supervisor, to remain on the force, collecting a paycheck, adding funds to their pension, 1 year later, it makes a really condemning statement about policing in New York City, and I can really see why the morale is really strained, because when you have a bad officer, you deal with the bad officer and you reward the good officers. and you support the good officers, and they're not getting the support that they deserve for protecting the city and keeping it safe. And instead of them getting support, we get this polarization regarding race, and that's not really what it's about, because all communities want to be safe. And I guarantee you, if many people had to deal with these thugs like they had to, like when I was in high school in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, that it would be a different story, because nobody knows how bad New York City once was, or how horrible it once was. And if you had to live in it, you would not be dealing with it the way it is. And I really fear that another term of Bill DeBlasio could lead to a return to this anarchy. And sadly, I believe that Joe Lotto was pretty much right in his ad. A lot of people said that was a negative ad, but I'm looking at the actions, and they speak louder than the words. That's all I have to say in this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe.